speaker series. It's not uncommon that we have a policymaker give a presentation, and it's even less uncommon that we have an academic, but it is quite rare that we have someone who is both a policymaker and an academic. And so we're really pleased to welcome the Honorable Denise Ducheny to give our talk today. Senator Ducheny served in the California legislature for a long time, I think a total of 14 years, from 1994 to 2000 in the Assembly, where she chaired the Assembly Budget Committee, and then from 2002 to 2010 in the California State Senate. She's currently, as I mentioned, also an academic, but in the best possible way. She's a lecturer in urban studies at UC San Diego, and she's also senior policy advisor at the UC San Diego Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies. And she's here to talk on a very timely issue, California and Mexico, the need for joint policies to maintain competitiveness. So Senator Ducheny, welcome.
Am I there yet? Yeah, okay, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Kravitz and the others here for the opportunity to meet with you all. I really enjoyed it. I went around and visited some of the presentations, so I'll do a brief commercial interruption for UCSAC. But those of you, the students who are here studying public policy, I know it may be out of school at UC, but I want to encourage you, if you're interested and you've piqued your interest by being in this program as undergraduates, to consider looking at the Capital Fellows Program when you graduate, which is run out of your neighbor, where I understand some of you are staying, at Sac State. But executive internships, legislative internships, the Fellows Program is sort of one of the best. And I could give you lists of prominent people in the administration and in every lobbying firm and major organization here in the town who were former fellows. They've done incredible work, from the senior counsel at the California Medical Association to folks who have their own firms who represent a lot of major clients, to folks who are active in the administration in various places. One of my former fellows is working for Covered California. They've moved into a lot of great places, and it's a great program if you're willing to dedicate a year to being free labor, which is why the legislature loves it. One free legislative aid every year is, we compete for fellows. That's the way that works. The competition is both to get into the program on your part and on our part to get you to want to come to our office when you get there. But one of my former staff was not a fellow to me, but he was in the Executive Fellows Program at the Secretary of State's office. He's now a city councilman in San Diego. So there are a lot of stories like that, and if you're interested in public policy, the rest of you, there's a lot of legislative staff here. Raise your hands so all the students can see who you are and bother you later. Yeah. But the legislative staff could, because a lot of them later become, one of my former fellows, I just found out last night, she's now the undersecretary at Cal EPA. So, there are opportunities around, and you should talk to the staff about what they do and how they go. Well, my former chief, I shouldn't do this. Maria Alvarez, where are you, Maria? Maria was my chief of staff when I was in the Assembly, and helped bring on all those fellows to my office, and kept track of where all they went. So, and she's at Haku now. So there's a lot of folks that move around here in interesting ways. So thank you for the opportunity and for the chance to talk to you about something that I don't think gets talked about enough up here. The relationship between California and Mexico, but has suddenly moved to the top of the food chain over the last 6 months with the election of a president who likes to talk about Mexico, but in ways that the rest of us sort of don't recognize. Those of us who've worked in U.S.-Mexico border relations for years, I represented, just see the background of it, I chaired the Budget Committee in both the Assembly and in the Senate, but on the side, I always had a committee that was about cooperation with Mexico because my district was the district that touches the U.S.-Mexico border. I represented in the Assembly sort of the western side, Chula Vista and the border region in San Diego. And my Senate district had all of the border from the ocean to the river, as I like to say, all of the U.S. border with Mexico, including Imperial County, chunks of San Diego, and portions of Riverside. So the border, for me, is a local issue. It was about state issues and local issues. The border is not international issues in our world. It's just how local issues are impacted by federal and international decisions and decision making. So one of the courses I teach at UCSD is binational regional governance, because for us, there is no regional government unless you're including Mexico. Unless you're including Tijuana and Tecate and Ensenada, you can't make a logical transportation or land use plan. You can't deal with sewage treatment. You can't deal with water use. You can't. All of those things are connected in our world. So it's a separate lecture that I'm not doing today, but I just sort of just want to make that clear to folks, because it is harder for people to get that north of LA, even up to LA sometimes, how that works, because our border is different. You know, Texas has this big, long, huge border, like 1,200 miles. Ours is narrow. It's only 2 counties worth. It's 120, a couple hundred miles, right? 200 miles. But so in our state is 1,000 miles long. So those of you who live up here and folks who live north of Sacramento and people in San Francisco, it's a long ways to the border. I mean, I used to kid around with one of my colleagues who represented the Eureka area. He lived closer to Canada and I lived closer to Mexico than we did to each other. And it's important for us to put California, especially in these difficult times, in the global context. We are kind of the connecting route between Canada and Mexico. Us, Oregon, Washington, we're the only region, the western region is the only place where the border touches both the southern and northern, you know? Sort of the Midwest has Canada, Texas has Mexico, but in the East Coast has nobody. Well, the northern part has Canada. I mean, here is where everything comes together in a 3-nation world. And so I think in some ways we have adapted more to that world than some of these other areas. We are more conscious of it. We're conscious of our exports and our imports and our economic relationship. And we need to be increasingly conscious of what we do with students and how we interact at that level. This is just for those of you, as you become graduate students, commercial number 2, UC San Diego Center for U.S. Mexican Studies. We are part of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD, which does offer some undergraduate, but mostly master's programs in public policy and in global, I don't know. They do all sorts of cool economic stuff that I don't understand, statistics and, but international relations, basically. Master's in something like international relations. I forget what they call it now. But our center is the Mexico kind of research center. We have a lot of centers focused on Asia, and all of that is part of GPS. So it's about international education, international relations, international economics, and those kind of programs through our master's programs. And the center, we have our core program is a fellows program for basically doctoral students or postdocs to come and spend a year when they're working on writing projects and dissertations and such, to interact with each other and to be in the border region, because San Diego is in that unique place. So our center does work, people are engaged in work regarding Mexico, regarding U.S.-Mexico relations, and regarding Mexicans in the U.S., sort of that combination of both immigrant studies, binational relations studies, and the actual, a lot of our scholars are folks who focus on Mexico as a whole. The center's been around for more than 30 years and has produced 600 or 700 really quality alumni who are professors and folks in government throughout the Mexico, U.S., and a few even in Europe. So, and what we want to talk about today is a project that we've been working on. We call it the Students We Share, Los Estudiantes que Compartimos, that we are working together. Anybody from UCLA? You don't count. Our Didi doesn't count. Patricia Gandara, some of you may know Patricia Gandara is the professor at UCLA, who, at least when I was in the legislature, I used to call on as the expert witness every time you had to talk about bilingual education or migrant students in this state. She is working with us on this study. And what we have is a course. We call it the Mexican Migration Field Research Program. And it is now focused, it used to do, it's been around for a while, and it's a 3-course program where you do a theory, you have an actual in the field research, and then you work on analyzing that research. In the past, a lot of times the students went further into Mexico, down into Oaxaca, some of what used to be called the sending villages of migrants, and some of those kinds of areas, studied issues in central Mexico. But more recently, what we've chosen to do with this program is make it border-centered. And so we are now in partnership with the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, the College of the Northern Border in Tijuana, and UABC, the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California in Tijuana. We are in partnership with their students. So students from UCSD, students from those institutions work together in this course to study high school students on both sides of the border and how to look at that. So we've done a survey of last year. They did surveys of 6,500 9th and 10th graders in San Diego and Tijuana, looking at this migration issues. And some of you may be aware, and I know some of the legislative offices are starting to look at some of these questions, but we have a lot of students down there, and we'll give you some more facts on that as we go along. But this flow has become really interesting, and our premise essentially is that people don't totally understand yet the cross-border economy and the cross-border workforce that's needed to support that economy. And our premise is we will be more competitive as a state if we keep working together with Mexico to build this workforce that, in fact, is a workforce that's supporting an economy that is increasingly interdependent and cross-dependent. And we're not really paying attention, and we have a lot of places where some of these students could fall between the cracks that we need to be addressing in a public policy sense. So initially, we like to point out the cross-border economy. This is just West Coast, $350 million a day. The district that I represented near where I live in San Diego, we have 3,000 trucks that cross each way each day in the port of entry at Otay Mesa, bringing goods and services across. We have more than 100,000 people and cars that cross every day in San Diego back and forth. We have a sort of a commuter population. We have all of the we have people coming to eat and people coming to shop, and all of us going in both directions whenever you don't have to sit in the line for more than an hour or two. Infrastructure is a problem. It continues to be an issue. But this is the volume. I mean, California, we have studies that show the Wilson Center, another interesting place to look for information on Mexico. But California, Mexico is our number one trading partner. We are an international economic state, and Mexico is our number one trading partner. And Mexico as a whole is the number two trading partner for the entire United States. Not number three, actually, but it's number two in exports. So what it is Canada, China, and Mexico all compete in that universe. But Mexico is our number two export nation. You hear a lot of people talking about trade deficits and, gosh, we import too much from Mexico. But the truth is our exports to Mexico as a nation are greater. And China is a larger trading partner, so Mexico becomes third in the trading partner game. But it's because China, our relationship is very import-based. We import from China, but we export to Mexico. We also import from Mexico, but I'll get to some of what that actually means in a minute. But since 1993, exports from California to Mexico have increased by more than 300%. We believe there's more than 500,000, probably closer to 600,000 jobs in California tied to trade with Mexico. And the products are things like computers and electronic goods and things coming out of Silicon Valley, and a lot of our goods and services. This shows all of the regions around the country. The trade between the United States and Mexico is more than 566, I think is the last number I saw, billion a year. Billion with a B, right? 5 million jobs. All those folks that are all freaked out about trade with Mexico and Canada, they all have jobs that are tied to trade with Mexico and Canada. In Ohio, they create. In Ohio, they make. They have more than 150, close to 200,000 jobs that are tied to U.S. trade with Mexico that are at risk with some of the trade policies that are being talked about. The second largest market for most states in the United States. If it's not the first market, like it is for all of the border states, California, Arizona, Utah, Texas, all Mexico's their number one trading partner. For most other states in the interior, they're number two. Canada's number one, and Mexico's number two. But they all have jobs. Ohio exports close to $7 billion worth of goods value to Mexico every year. And a lot of it goes to this question of supply chains. What's happened over the last 20 years, and this is the change, I think, since NAFTA was signed. It's not just about trading your thing for my thing. What we now have and what's developed over the 20 years and sort of the economics of it is a joint supply chain. And it's true for Canada. I was reading an article today where Prime Minister Trudeau was making the same point, that Canada and the U.S., just like Mexico and the U.S., have developed these interdisciplinary, interdependency supply chains, so that the auto part is made in Ohio, is sent to Mexico to be installed in an engine that is sent back to Michigan to be put in a casing and then sent back to Mexico to be installed in a car. I mean, you have that kind of interaction going on, and we think a lot of goods and services in San Diego, certainly, and in other areas as well, cross the border 6 or 7 times, and that's what Trudeau said today, too. The car parts cross the border 6 or 7 times between the U.S. and Canada before you get a finished product. And in San Diego, we see that also in a variety of industries: biotechnology, biomedical devices, aerospace products, cars, certainly to some degree, although we're not a big car place. We are the San Diego, Tijuana. Okay, here's the trivia question of the week. Largest producer of televisions in the world as a region. San Diego, Tijuana together. Not alone, not one or the other, together. But San Diego, Kyocera, Samsung, all those major companies, they have presence in San Diego and presence in Tijuana. They do some manufacturing there, and they do some on the other side. So what you have is created this interesting supply chain, and that's just how the economic. I don't think people set out to do that, but that's the way it worked. When you started creating content-based trade relationships, that's where people got to is, well, gosh, we'll do what we can do the best wherever we can do it. And now you have a product, and what we were encouraging was the sense of a regional product, so that the region, the North American region, sells that product to China or Europe or whoever they're selling it to, not just we make our little thing and we sell it to you and you barter it back to us. That's not happening anymore. So how we adjust to this new economic reality is, I think, part of what we're doing. This is sort of examples. Thermo Fisher just opened a facility in Carlsbad in San Diego County, but it's tied to the fact that we talked them into doing a software center in Tijuana. They're sort of, and Kyocera, as I mentioned, the Little Guitars is a company in El Cajon called Taylor Guitars. They manufacture guitars both in El Cajon and in Tecate, California, Baja California. They make their higher end quality in El Cajon, and they make some of their more everyday guitars in Tijuana, and they sell them both, and it makes the company prosper. DJO was a company in Vista, northern San Diego County. Started out with 50 or 100 employees on both sides, in San Diego and in Tijuana. They now have 2,000 employees on each side of the border. So it's not always a cost. Just the creating the jobs in Tijuana also creates jobs in San Diego. We think you get like half a job in San Diego for every job created in Tijuana. There's and the content, the sort of where the trade statistics get funky, on this idea that there's a deficit with our trade with Mexico. Yes, if you actually say the value of the things we import from Mexico and the value of the things we export to Mexico, there is a difference of about $60 million, except that for every product that we import from Mexico, we believe about 40% of the content of that product was made in the United States to begin with. So if you add that back in, the deficit goes the other way. Mexico's at a disadvantage because, again, those parts are being made in the U.S. before they're installed in the product. So you treat the finished product as an import from Mexico, even if 60% of that product or 40% of that product was created in the United States before it went to Mexico to get assembled. And that's the supply chain issue that kind of has been missing in a lot of the discussion. Wilson Center has a lot of this data. If I sort of can't claim it as my own, but I read it, the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. has done a huge study, has every state, did the work to come up with the 40% number that all of us who talk border use nowadays. But that comparable number for China is 4%. So China, we really are just importing stuff made in China. But with Mexico, we're re-importing things that were made in the United States to begin with. So we have to think, that's why we got all these jobs tied to it. So Solar Turbines, another big company, its own subsidiary of Caterpillar, another one who has facilities in San Diego, has had facilities in San Diego forever, Solar Turbines. TurboTech in Tijuana is their affiliate. and they make these same fancy. They got these great. We did a tour there last year. They have these great big German fancy machines making. This is no longer the days of the little assembly. Yes, there are still assembly plants. Yes, there are still electronics plants, but the level of manufacturing in a place like Tijuana has changed significantly over the years. So what they're demanding now are second-level engineers, technical students, people to do software. These machines run by fancy software. They don't run by, right? So when we toured that factory, they had these fancy new German machines making big engine turbines for power plants, right? That's what they make, turbines, right? And they have these fancy things, and you need like a software engineer to run them, not some guy who just is mechanical. And the worker told me, what used to take me 5 days, I now machine. They do this fancy machining the parts inside this container with a software program, and what used to take him 5 days to do, he now does in an hour. Right? But what does that worker need? He needs a new level skill, right? And so Tijuana is screaming for engineers at the same way that Silicon Valley is. Plantronics, anybody from Santa Cruz? Plantronics, big Silicon Valley, we got a big plant in make all those Bluetooth devices and all that fancy stuff in Tijuana, right at the border, right across from the fence. So what's our advantage? Well, we have a lot of Mexican immigrants in the United States, over 11 million now, about a third of all of the immigrants in the United States. Not all of them, as some people might make you think. Mexicans account for about a third. There are a lot of foreign-born people in this country who come from countries from all over the world. But Mexico is obviously, and has been for many years, the largest amount, has gone up over the years, and certainly as a total of the population, Mexican migrant families. Quarter of those Mexicans live in California. So of all the Mexicans who live in the United States, 25% of them live in California. And most of those are in Southern California. And that's foreign-born, first, second generation. It's a combination, documented, undocumented, second-generation citizens like members of the legislature, but huge numbers of them. So it's an issue for California. It's a public policy issue in California to have these students be educated because they are our students and they are our population. The diaspora, again, first generation, actually born out of the United States, born in Mexico. You can see those numbers on the top. The second generation, even more so. But a lot of school-age folks, note those, the youth of this population is important to California's future workforce. Who are the future workers of California? Who are the future workers in the United States? Some of these young folks who are first and second generation immigrants. Over 200,000 DACA beneficiaries. A lot of you know DACA students, I know, from the universities. I had the number here. We have, what was it? I think it comes up later, but the number of DACA students. But, so the folks, 49% of these first and second generation folks are under 25, right? These are the people who are in our schools, getting ready to hopefully go to our colleges. But their incomes remain low at the moment, and how do we start to create these equities and equalities? Partly through education. So, immigrant families and education. We all know, and here's the graph that proves it, the higher your educational attainment, the more likely you are to earn a greater income. That's kind of the way the world works. That's why all of you went to college, right? And so you find that educational attainment obviously is related to income. And Latinos, these students, or whatever generation, are about half of the students now in Southern California classrooms. So for those of you from Northern California, we always forget this. California is a big, long state, 100,000 miles, and 2/3 of the people live in the southern third, right? South of the Tehachapi's, starting with LA County and the Southern California counties, is more than 20 million people out of our 40, right? So, and that population is more heavily Latino than the population in the north, too. I mean, there's certainly a lot of Latinos and go through the Central Valley, and certainly in this area it's not like they don't exist, but the concentration is much greater in the LA, Inland Empire, San Diego universe. and what are we doing about this? Well, our students, the Latino students, tend to be in the schools that aren't doing as well, right? On the APIs, they're the 1 and 2 schools, not the 9 and 10 schools. The English learners, even more so. So this is what the governor was trying to address in part with the local school funding formula that came out a few years ago. I mean, legislature's been looking at these issues as long as I can remember before I was even in it. I was on a community college board for a minute before that, and we've all been looking at these issues since the 60s and 70s. How do we think about it? But the volume and the significance of it keeps increasing as these numbers go up, and these issues come before us. So the graduation rates are still too low. The A through G requirement completion is low. What are we doing in schools? And here's start to be your public policy questions. But what are we doing in schools to support these students? What are we doing to get them? Where's Haku? Where are you, Maria? What are we doing to get them into college? Right? There's issues I know, and some of you will be aware of them. Certainly in the colleges, we have issues with counseling and how we address keeping students at, what do you call that? Stop from attritioning. The continuation rate. How do we keep students in school is certainly an ongoing issue at the university level, has been for years. But it's also an issue, how do we get kids into school? And how do we make room for them, and how do we make programs that make sense? So DACA students, again, California, about 75,000 of the almost 3 million students in the UCCSU and community college systems in California are DACA, and we're given tuition based on AB 540. Residents, even though they're undocumented, some of them may be DACA. There's kind of this mix now, I think, with DACA and didn't qualify for DACAs, and who knows. But it's a substantial number of our students, and ours way disproportionately to the rest of the nation. Partly because we were aggressive in the early part in doing things like AB 540, and trying to bring people back into the system and trying to make the system available. I know, is anybody here from Senator Lara's office? Senator Lara, I know, is doing some work on some of these issues about how do we continue to make this available, education to migrant students. But in recent years, what we've had is these removals, and we're starting to see even more of this. There's a lot of fear, obviously, in all the communities about removals that aren't based on felons. But we've had this migration going back to Mexico. Since 2009 or so, I think a Pew Research Center you can look at, the migration from Mexico has been lower than the migration returning to Mexico. There's a net negative migration from Mexico to the U.S. over the since 2009. The recession obviously helped. Certain deportations helped. All sorts of, and Mexico's growing economy and improved economy helped too. So all of those things combined together to create a situation where we now have more people returning to Mexico every year than coming to the United States from Mexico. This could be a real problem in the future for our workforce, if you think about that. But it's good for Mexico, and it's actually good for the stability of the entire region to have both economies working, on all cylinders. So, but we have a net negative migration from Mexico during the last, I think it's been since 2009, and we have not changed that trajectory. So the trajectory for a long time went this way, people coming in versus going out, and now it's going this way. So we've had these removals, and now Mexico is facing an interesting public policy problem, which is they have all these U.S.-born kids in their schools. So we've struggled for years here. Xochitl, other people here know about, we've struggled for years here trying to figure out how to integrate immigrant students and bilingual education. Some of you saw the proposition was at 58 on the ballot to repeal so people could get back into doing bilingual education. People have been working on these issues in the United States for a long time, particularly in California, because we have such high immigrants. I remember a period, and I don't know if these is true, but our English language learners, but what's interesting with California was always we have the most of everything that's not where they belong. So, the most Mexicans who live outside of Mexico, the most Filipinos who live outside of the Philippines, the most Vietnamese who live outside of Vietnam, they all live in California. And so our languages are this wide variety. We needed to think about how to do English language learning education, not just in Spanish, but in Vietnamese and in Hmong. And in, the original case, for any of you who want to be law students, the original bilingual education case in this country is called Lau versus Nichols. It came out of San Francisco, and it was about Chinese students. It wasn't about Mexico. Plyer versus Doe, the case that allowed all residents, regardless of immigration status, to attend school, came out of Texas. that did involve Mexican students. So, some of these things apply to a lot of areas. But so we have in 2010, 300,000. 2015, another 400,000. We think today there's probably about 1 million U.S. born or having been at some point educated in the U.S. students living in Mexico. And half of those, 1 out of every 8 of them live in Baja California, which is our neighbor region and our local region in some ways. I talked earlier about, so what are sort of the policy implications of the education of this population? And this Mexican Migration Field Research Project has kind of focused on, what are the determinants inside and outside of schools that lead to this gap? And what are the aspirations of these students? What resources and programs could be available to these binational students? How do we think about programs? So how do we think about programs that can move the needle on these populations, that change the trajectory of those numbers that we're seeing about folks who get into college and don't get into college? So the base of the research, the first cohort of this research was done last year in this course, and a representative sample of students across the region did 6,500 students in Tijuana. You can see here mostly 9th and 10th graders is who we focused on both sides of the border. In Sweetwater, which is the Sweetwater High School District, is the high school district in the San Diego metropolitan area that is adjacent to the border, and it is the largest high school district in the state, standalone. There's unified districts like Los Angeles and I think Sacramento. Are you unified? Sacramento's unified, right? So there's a lot of unified districts. They're certainly larger, but of those that are standalone high school districts, Sweetwater does middle school and high school in the region that encompasses Chula Vista, National City, and all of the southern San Diego City region along the border region. It is huge population of Latino and Filipino and other immigrant students, so we did that district, and we've done some in San Diego Unified as well, which is obviously a larger district and a little more diverse. In some ways, diverse in the sense of more multiples of everything. Sweetwater's diverse in the sense that it's non-white, but it's not. It's a little bit white. I mean, it's very minimal number of white students, but it has everything, but it's predominantly Latino, as opposed to San Diego, who maybe has 25% Latino, but has some of everybody, right? More so. So here's the picture. You can see the Sweetwater district that Tijuana. So the data I'm going to show you today, we have San Diego Unified data, but it's later and it's not as integrated into these numbers. So we surveyed them on these personal characteristics. Who's your family? Who are you? Where you come from? What are you doing? What's your school life like? What do you think of school? What happens? Where are you going? Who do you think of yourself as? And then we did skills assessments to a smaller cohort of students. PISA is the public program for international student assessment. That's a test created through the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and they administer this as an international global students, trying to compare students worldwide. It's a test that's administered worldwide to sort of assess students internationally. It's to 15-year-olds every year, and then they produce the results. You can go on their website and find what to tell you about the characteristics of students in any given country that they've offered the test in. They had more than 500,000, I think I looked at it the other day, more than 500,000 students took the test in 2015, for instance. So we used that test to administer to a cohort of the students that we surveyed to see where their standing was. And they defined binational. We had to create a scale to think about how do you define what's a binational student. So we gave points for where are your parents, where are you from, where have you lived, how many times do you cross the border do you cross every week, do you cross every month, do you cross every year, how often have you been to the other country, what's your experience in the other country, those kind of things, and your family and such background. So, and they did this whole scale, worked up the scale, how many points you get for what. to kind of create some numbers to go with this. And what we find is that half of our region students on both sides of the border, this is the total pool, have some kind of connection above the 2 points. So either they got family connections, they cross frequently, they've studied in the other country. Some huge numbers, more so on the Sweetwater side than on the Tijuana side, because there aren't quite as many. Obviously, there's a lot more immigrant Mexicans living in Sweetwater than there are Americans living in Tijuana, even if it's a large number proportional what Tijuana's had in the past. It's still not relative to the size, but you can see here. But on the Tijuana side, you see a lot of parents, a lot of crossing. You get, the Tijuana side, you get a lot of, sort of the twos and the twos and threes. On the U.S. side, you get even stronger correlations, often for people who studied on the other side. And of all these students, what was fascinating to us was the aspirations. These are students who really think they should be going to college. They talk to their friends about the future. They believe they will earn a university degree. These are not people without the aspiration. And what are we doing to get them there? This totally contradicts the numbers we saw earlier about how many actually graduate and how many actually go to college, right? So we know that their aspirations are there, and somehow we're not letting them meet those, right? How do we make those two numbers come together? They think it's important to go to college, and they face barriers. They recognize to some degree the barriers. They recognize that they may not be able to afford to go to college, right? That's always an issue. But the 54% who say they don't know what university they want to attend, that's a failure of our school system to do counseling, right? What do we do to tell students what it is you have to do to get into college? Who tells them about A through G requirements and what it is, in fact, required to go there? How do we think it's not counseling? And so how do we think, like policy-wise, and for purposes of our study, we want to sort of look at some pilots that we're hoping some folks might fund to let us try some interventions. What kind of after-school programs do we need? Do we need Saturday schools? How do we keep people's language up so both sides of the border is working for them, right? Because these students get it. That they rely, and now they do rely on their schools, which goes back to this problem of what do we have as resources in the schools to help them understand. Even having college students like yourselves go to those schools and tell them, what did you do to get into college, right? Those kinds of programs don't exist like in a program form. There's bits and pieces of it. I mean, there are some programs like that around, but there's not, I suspect, somebody else do that research, but to what extent those programs kind of exist in California schools. And I don't know if it was in here. I thought it was in those slides. But one of the other things these students get, let's see, that they will be working on both sides of the border. But they've lived and studied on both sides of the border, and they see the international career for themselves. They understand that the opportunity that exists is in being this binational student. So what's tricky here is we've got these students who are likely to fall through the cracks. You go to another country, you don't always speak the language, and Mexico's now confronting this issue of students coming to school. How do we get the transcripts? How do we get them credit? And we've seen students who fall through the cracks at 10th grade because they can't seem to get the bureaucracy to appreciate their transcript from the other side, right? And Mexico's working on that. So Mexico's been facing some of these public policy issues. And then is how do you keep your language? Keeping your language, and even if it's not, bilingual, personally, I'm a big fan of dual immersion programs, period, everywhere. And we have biliteracy certificates in the U.S. and at least in California. But at least keeping up the level that you came in with. How do you make sure people don't lose their fluency, whatever fluency they had in the language where they came from, so that they then can take that future as an asset? This is an asset to be bilingual, to be bicultural, to be biliterate, to be able to work on two sides of a frontier where people are manufacturing goods on two sides. That is a commodity in demand in the workforce environment that we live in. So how do we harvest that in some ways is really the challenge that I think we're trying to present with this study, that this is a resource. These binational students, whichever side of the border they happen to live on today, are kind of this resource. And what are we doing to make sure that we can harvest that and allow them to realize those expectations. So what are the policy issues, and how do we face this again? Back to the issue. This needs to be together. It's us and Mexico. We're in this together. These students, a lot of these students in Tijuana are U.S. citizens who will be looking to come back to UC when they graduate from high school in Tijuana, and they are U.S. citizens, and they will be allowed to come back, right? So how do we think about keeping those student skills to the level where they can come back? And how do we work with Tijuana to make sure they understand what an A through G requirement is, so when the student comes back, they're kind of ready to go? What are we doing if they want to go back to Mexico to study? And how do we make these connections, and how do we build UC Mexico initiative, certainly the work some of our centers doing, but other exchange programs. We were talking today about foreign exchange programs, but what are we doing to prepare? And it doesn't just have to be the kids from the border. This binational workforce issue is real for students who live in LA, or for to understand that world and the value of being bilingual, biliteral, bicultural. Get this economy. Think about how these things work, understand the culture and the economics of the other country. This is a whole world, and frankly, for the U.S., even more advantage because it opens up all of Latin America to you, not just Mexico, right? So a lot happening in those worlds in the future, and I don't know that we appreciate that enough, or instill in students the appreciation for where you came from can be your future if you will take advantage of it. So we are the study and the work of the Mexican Migration Field Research Project is sort of planning out a decade-long initiative to try to think of some of these interventions, some pilots that we can test the data. We work with an evaluation center we have as part of our global School of Global Policy and Strategy has a evaluation center for programs. So we're trying to design projects, think of some ways to do them. To fund them and to make them happen, and then to evaluate them and see what works. What is it that we can do that will make a difference in a given cohort of students, and what difference can make? So it goes back to that intersection between academia and research and public policy. Public policy, at least in my experience over there, should be based on fact. It's always helpful. And if you have, facts and figures and graphs and charts, you give policymakers the ability to think about what matters. I mean, how do we, is what we're doing working? It's a huge thing. I know some of you, I saw a few of the demonstrations earlier. Is what we're doing working? And if it's not, then let's change it. But how do we, it's better if we change it based on some kind of data, right? And certainly some of you, another place to look at public policy issues certainly is the Legislative Analyst's Office. Great place to get started. A lot of folks around here get started. But they're real research-based, I mean, that's who they are. They're like, wonks in a corner. But they do wonky stuff, But they got to learn how to talk to legislators who are not wonky. So legislators don't come from that world. You got to learn how to talk to folks who are just ground people and who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, but still make your data, get some policy, get some data, and figure out how to translate that in a way that works with public world. And legislators are no different than the rest of the public at some level. It's a more general audience that's not going to necessarily have the background in your topic but you need folks who are going to do that rigorous analysis. So the LAO produces, economic analysis, analysis of projects and programs to help the legislature understand what's working and what's not, right? That's critical information to what we do. So I think that was my last slide. Okay. So there you go. Tried to leave a little room for questions.
So I'll try to run and pass the mic around.
Tell me something I don't know.
So I guess.
Oh, they're there. Okay, I guess we talked it out.
I'll start you off with a broad question, Senator Ducheny. So, in the long run and on a global basis,